Thank you, Larry. Welcome, and thank you for being here. I'll start by saying what a thrill it is to be here. I'm a big fan of the work that ERIE does, so it's nice to be on the other side of things and adding to the conversation. And also, tonight's themes are of increasing importance. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to give you a few caveats. First, memory is not my biggest bowl of cherries, so I will be reading from my notes a bunch. Please keep in mind that this presentation pertains largely to techno-industrial cultures, and also it's highly theoretical, and hopefully a bit controversial. So I hope you have fun with it and find something of value that you can take with you. So the title of tonight's talk is Entheogens and Collective Individuation, Evolutionary Synergents and the Myceliation of a Post-Patriarchal Paradigm. One might wonder a lot of things about that, including what that has to do with the themes of sustainability and regenerative practices. So while this talk won't directly touch upon those themes, what we'll be doing is trying to lead up to them and try and propagate a mycelial dais for the rest of tonight's presentations to spring from. In order to do that, I'll be sharing with you some ideas of how we got here. Why do we even need symposiums and practices themed on sustainability, regenerative practices, and eco-mindedness in the first place? How did we get to a stage of affairs where such drastic measures are needed to balance out our collective mindset and behaviors? So first, let's begin with a brief overview of the talk to give you a blueprint and a mental map. The through line of this talk is the shift from patriarchy to post-patriarchy. What we're trying to establish is a dendritic arc of the process of patriarchy, and is trying to establish different ways that the world is transforming into a post-patriarchal planet. To do this, this presentation imagines that humanity as a species is undergoing a process of what I'm calling collective individuation, which is similar to personal individuation, meaning that extremely long ago we collectively began individuating from Mother Earth and the values she had been instilling in us. In that gap arose the patriarchal ego thousands of years ago, which in turn began instilling in us new values and modes of being. And now, these days, we're in the beginning stages of individuating from patriarchy. So that's the gist of the talk. Let's flesh it out. So in order to explore collective individuation, we should first get into personal individuation. My two main sources for personal individuation are Jungian interpretations and the work of Margaret Mahler. Individuation has many different interpretations these days. One of my favorites is the poetic rendering by Murray Stein. Margaret Mahler developed separation individuation theory regarding child development. So it's important to note that for both Mahler and Jung, individuation is a lifelong process. So that is personal individuation very briefly. The idea with collective individuation is that a critical mass of humanity is currently undergoing a process as a species which mirrors some of the dynamics of personal individuation. This is not saying that everyone today is explicitly undergoing this process or that it has never happened to groups of people before in history, since this process, like so many other processes, is not uniform. But it is saying that this is the largest movement of individuation that we've ever undertaken. Part of this process, it is also saying that every human in humanity as a species, as a whole, is a part of this process and plays a role in this process, as does the rest of the planet. Assuming that we can say that all individual human consciousnesses are unfolding within the greater consciousness of the human species, which itself is unfolding within the greater consciousness of the planet, and so forth and so on. So that's what is meant by collective individuation, in part. Individuation is comprised of the continual movements of differentiation and integration, analysis and synthesis. It's like a dance. The first movement of collective individuation was when humanity began differentiating from Mother Earth and the rest of nature. We don't have time to go into the details of how and when this differentiation began, but it's important to bear in mind that differentiation in this theory is not a separation from nature, because that's impossible and nothing is outside of nature. In this differentiation from the rest of nature, we began to distance ourselves from Mother Earth and all the values she had been teaching us for hundreds of thousands of years. In this distancing, naturally, a gap arose, a psychological abyss. This abyss is symbolic of our discomfort and dis-ease of our newfound position away from our mother. As a great sense of loss and anxiety was released in the depths of our collective psyche, which we can still feel to this day. It seems this abyss, which can be understood as a trauma and psychological disturbance during our collective youth, would then be one of the primary sources for much of our psycho-emotional imbalances later on and into the present. We have not been able to fill the gap. This leads into the next step of collective individuation. From this tension deep within the abyss, as a means to cope with this loss and anxiety, arises the patriarchal ego, the symbolic father figure which now assumes the role previously held by our earthly instincts. Having learned to an adequate degree what Mother Earth had to teach us, she then stepped back and was also the one who distanced herself from us, so that we could embark on our individuation process and continue evolving as a species. This is where patriarchy steps in, the symbolic father figure, the hero, the protector, here to teach us new ways of being as individuals. Speaking in admittedly binary terms, patriarchy steps in to instill masculine values into our previously predominantly feminine consciousness. But within this theory, these new values are meant to eventually be integrated with the more earthly values we were first shown, and they are meant to complement each other, as are all opposites, so-called opposites. You may be wondering about the validity of taking a theoretical leap from personal individuation to collective individuation. That's an appropriate concern, but I think there's precedence for it all around us. I'd now like to introduce you to the theory of fractal dynamics. I'll read this definition for those of you that are auditory learners. Fractal dynamics is the phenomena of similar dynamics, principles, or patterns manifesting in different dimensions or scales of reality. Meaning that a single dynamic, pattern, or principle is occurring on two or more different scales of reality, with the different scales considered to be micro and macro components of a larger system or whole, often leading to feedback spirals. We can see examples of fractal dynamics all over the place. Here are some examples of general fractal patterns, and you can see the self-similar pattern manifesting at every scale of the fractal. And here are some examples of fractal dynamics in action. You can see the same mycelial pattern happening on all different scales of reality, from the brain cell, this top left, to the universe, to metropolises, to the mapping of data flow on the internet, to gaseous nebula, to the human eye. It's the same pattern occurring on multiple scales and dimensions of reality. And then in the middle here, on the left, we have the birth of a cell and the death of a star, a supernova, both exemplifying the torus field. The electromagnetic field of the Earth also radiates in a torus field, as does the electromagnetic pulse of your heart. But these are all examples of fractal dynamics on physical planes. It's important to remember that within this theory, fractal dynamics can occur in non-physical dimensions, and they can also occur between the entire spectrum from physical to non-physical. This all reminds me of Indra's net, which is a Buddhist technique for visualizing the nature of reality as a participatory dance of infinite interconnection and relationality. Another example of fractal dynamics is that of personal individuation and collective individuation, at least within this context. And that brings us back to patriarchy. The thing with patriarchy is, while the patriarchal mindset may have further instilled in us novel values and ways of being, such as individualism, so-called rationality, so-called objectivity, linearity, top-down hierarchical structures, many of which have been of inestimable importance, we can now say that unchecked patriarchy has passed its prime. Patriarchy as we know it was never optimal, to put it lightly, but it is now absolutely anachronistic. This seems like a good time to provide the definition of patriarchy this presentation is working with. The basic understanding is patriarchy is the dominator operating system which has been structuring most other systems and forcing them to run its masculine and hierarchical programs. So from religion to spirituality to politics to science to farming practices, all the way down to the family structure and even personal identity, all of them follow the patriarchal dictates to varying degrees, as well as reinforce the values of patriarchy as what is normal and intrinsic to the social order, not to mention the rest of reality. Patriarchal consciousness is ubiquitous. One of the primary maneuvers that patriarchy pulled off in order to establish its dominance was the disenchantment of the rest of the world. Overall, in the switch from matriarchy to patriarchy, we went from a planet that was fully animated to one where the only ensouled protagonists were humans. And following the masculine power structure, men were the main protagonists at the top. It is this disenchantment in the rest of the world and reality, which is related to the development of the abyss and the perceived schism between humans and the rest of nature, that help engender the mindset of the present, where it sometimes seems many of us are doing our best to actually kill, to destroy life and Gaia herself. For if you believe that man is the only being with a soul, or the only agent with subjectivity, then it's a relatively easy step to objectifying the rest of nature in order to control it to suit your superior needs. So all of that is how this presentation understands patriarchy, which is halfway to our goal. The point of all this is post-patriarchy, and it seems as if we're somewhere in between the two, in a liminal state of potentiality, and on the precipice of a novel paradigm. So, what is a post-patriarchal paradigm and how do we get there? Well, I'm not exactly sure what that will be. The best I can do is guess what elements it might be comprised of, which is also my answer to how we can help co-create it and actualize it. Broadly speaking, it seems that all the things that patriarchy has been suppressing, oppressing, and attempting to eradicate for the last 8,000 to 12,000 years are now the primary elements motivating the differentiation from patriarchy, and are simultaneously some of the primary forces aiding in the shift and myceliation into a post-patriarchal paradigm. Some of those oppressed modalities include the feminine, feminism, indigenous, native, queer, terra, and psychedelic modalities and consciousnesses, which are increasingly coming into their own today. While this presentation will briefly focus on ontogens or psychedelics, it is readily apparent that all of them are interconnected in a matrix of intersectionality. Not only do they have common fundamental principles, but they all have a common oppressor, patriarchy. Patriarchy is the common denominator in this equation, whether one is talking about sexism, racism, classism, LGBTQ phobia, genocide, environmental degradation, or economic disparity. They can all be traced back to the dominator meme of patriarchy. Though, on the other hand, when speaking of patriarchy, we should note that patriarchy in this context is a natural process, unfolding within the larger process of collective individuation. So we're not necessarily trying to suppress or eradicate or pathologize patriarchy, for those are patriarchal principles, which is what we're trying to evolve from. And naturally, various patriarchal principles will be part of the patriarchal paradigm, the post-patriarchal paradigm. much in the same way that Christian principles are still being run by the scientific paradigm. Everyone's invited to the party, and everyone is valid. Also, patriarchy does have some redeeming qualities. So why emphasize entheogens in the process of post-patriarchy? Other than that, this is an ERIE event. I wish there were more time to really delve into this since it's so fascinating and is gaining momentum, but for now, here's the gist. What is being proposed here, following the lead of many others, is that ontogens, or psychedelics, have been in a synergetic and symbiotic relationship not only with humanity, but with our ancestors and all the way through into the present. From our evolution, excuse me, I forgot some slides. From our evolution to the development of religions and civilizations, there is mounting evidence that ontogens have played an integral role to varying degrees in a lot of it, and have thus been an extremely beneficial and influential participant in our evolution and history. Not to mention art, technology, sexuality, mysticism, music, and psychology. Here we'll also briefly focus on the role of entheogens in religion, Western civilization, and human evolution. We know for sure that entheogens were used by people at least 6,000 years ago. We know for sure that the soma of the Vedas was entheogenic, and there's mounting evidence that the Kaikion brew of the Eleusinian mystery rites of ancient Greece was also psychedelic. And additionally, regarding religion, there are theories collating evidence that Judaism and Christianity were also started by psychedelic groups. All of that is either fact or substantiated by evidence, but we have to move on, so let's get into the highly hypothetical. To do that, we'll invoke none other than the late, great Terence McKenna, the epitome of hypothetical. How many of you are familiar with McKenna's stoned ape theory of human evolution? Stoned ape theory of human evolution. Okay, and how many of you think there's something to it? Yeah, cool. Well, I love preaching to the choir, so. Nonetheless, this is an extremely speculative and controversial hypothesis, but that makes it more fun. For those of you that don't know, briefly, the stoned ape theory of human evolution posits that our ancestors came across some form of psychedelic as they moved from the trees and into the plains of Africa. In searching for new food sources, they naturally came to the many hypothetical piles of grub-laden dung strewn about the plains. One of the symbionts of dung, other than insects, is the magic mushroom. The quick and dirty version is that in repeatedly being exposed to various doses of psychedelic technology while rooting through the dung piles, our ancestors were bequeathed various adaptive benefits that helped them outpace their so-called competitors in the game of neo-Darwinistic evolution. More importantly for McKenna is that psychedelics helped catalyze the development of the prefrontal cortex. So that's the all too quick version. How do we connect this to patriarchy and post-patriarchy? Even if we don't allow for the stoned ape theory, which I think would be a mistake, we know that entheogens have been an important part of human history for thousands of years, in the very least. Again, when patriarchy comes along, one of the things it does is suppress, often violently, anything that it perceives as other, which is most of reality. Anything that it perceives as a threat to its singular type of consciousness is oppressed, and eradication and appropriation procedures are enacted. It's systemic. And that's what happened with entheogens with the onset of patriarchy. Entheogens turned from being understood as something largely magical to being perceived as something related to the art of so-called black magic. Particularly in the West and other techno-industrial cultures. This is what happened with the Eleusinian mysteries, which had previously been running for 2,000 years, until Orthodox Christianity came along and put the kibosh on it around 396 of the Common Era. Christianity, with its mostly male caste and masculine god at the pinnacle, is obviously running the patriarchy operating system to a T. The oppression, well, I should say Orthodox Christianity. The oppression of a plurality of modalities happened many times all over the planet, as patriarchy systematically attempted to sterilize the world and planetary consciousness. This is the war on consciousness. So it looks like I'm going to have to skip a bunch. Oh, no, I can make it. And yet, despite patriarchy's best efforts, here we are at a symposium espousing and advocating for these very modalities in an attempt to help repropagate them in order to co-create the next paradigm. Within the framework of this project, here is the importance of psychedelics. They are participants in our heritage. With respect and intention, they can continue to help heal, expand, and deepen our consciousness. They can help heal the misperception of the schism between humans and the rest of nature by myceliating across and into the abyss of our psyche, and help heal that deep wounding. And they can help synergize the co-creation of different and novel paradigms as psychedelics are increasingly implemented into a multiplicity of human fields and endeavors. Their role in the shift cannot be underestimated, and neither can that of the other forces coming into their own, such as women, the feminine, LGBTQ, indigenous and native peoples, and the earth herself. As these other types of consciousness continue to rise up and continue to grow in strength, join together and gain power, power with contrasted to power over. They will further infuse themselves into various fields such as religion, politics, art, science, music, sexuality, spirituality, academia, farming, and sustainable practices. And the masculine will continue to balance out. And the influence of unchecked patriarchy will slowly myceliate into a post-patriarchal paradigm and not solely a static dominator, a post-patriarchal paradigm based not solely on static dominator hierarchies, but on more horizontal and fluid values of receptivity, relationality, and cooperation. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be utopic or that it's going to be easy or that it's just around the corner. There's obviously a lot of resistance, which we can see readily all over the world today as the patriarchal ego continues to sense its unchecked reign diminishing and feel threatened by this change as any egoic structure would, and then overreact as it tries to reset its boundaries by puffing itself up and lashing out in different ways. Yet the point of this is that patriarchy feels threatened, and all that lashing out can be understood as symptoms of an ego death on a macro scale. This is where it seems we're at, and patriarchy's resistance will probably continue for a good long while, and things may get worse. But that's the challenge we have before us, which many of our ancestors stepped up to, and that's the call we and so many of us are heeding all across the world today. There's no way to tell for sure what will happen, yet it seems, and I hope, that it's only a matter of time, perseverance, and love. Mad, mad love. Thank you.
If anyone wants to ask any questions, please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone over to you. Question.
Wow.
Hi there.
Howdy.
So I noticed that you did qualify your discussion of patriarchy by saying that it's not all bad, but nevertheless the overall impact of your discussion kind of cast it in a really bad light. And I would like to suggest that it's just a system, and it may be being abused, but it isn't inherently bad. And there have been examples of very nurturing and productive patriarchies in the past. There have also been examples of out-of-control matriarchies. So, as in all things, balance in the middle path is the right course of action, and an excellent example of that would have been the Society of the Iroquois Confederacy, where men and women worked together equally. They each had their roles in society, and they respected each other, and that's what we need to be working towards. So I just don't want to, I think it's unhealthy to characterize.
I do think I did address that a few times throughout the talk. Your concern.
You did say
Right.
the right thing at some point, but in continuing to repeat patriarchy a great number
Well,
of times.
that's where I think we're at with patriarchy. I think it's completely out of balance, right? And I did say that it is just a system, part of the collective individuation. So we're on the same page, right? We agree. I don't think that we're disagreeing, but it sounds like you're disagreeing with me. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, over here. Are we on? Yeah. When talking about the elements of patriarchy that would continue on into a new paradigm, you mentioned such as has happened with Christianity, but then you characterized the shift as being into science, and I found that somewhat curious, but I do see in one respect, and perhaps this is what you meant, so perhaps you could clarify, that the shift would be to the experiential methodology rather than the scientific.
What I was saying is that patriarchal principles will transmit into the post-patriarchal paradigm, very similar to how Christian principles transmitted into the scientific paradigm.
Oh,
I wasn't
okay.
saying the post-patriarchal paradigm will be scientific. I
Oh,
do
good.
think
Okay.
scientific principles will be part of the post-patriarchal paradigm because it's
Right.
so dominant, right?
Well, yes,
but-
I could see the experiential one would
Yeah,
be one
but
of them.
experiential, somatic, yes, emotions, yeah, those will all hopefully be coming up after being suppressed for so long.
This is a very tricky differentiation between masculine and feminine. We have a masculinization in our political sphere,
Right.
where women, I heard Carly, what's her name, Farina, said, "I will beat Hillary. I will beat her." You know, so given a structure, you know, you see certain
Right.
so-called masculine aggressions manifesting within women
Right.
by virtue of the intention of the general structure. But relating to the microcosm and the fractal patterns, how do you see the balance of masculine and feminine evolving in the family unit, and how might that be effective in the general social balancing?
Well, I think one of the things that's going to happen is, you know, the patriarchal mindset with man at the top of every structure will come down, and the other elements will come up, and it'll be a more centered and relational paradigm rather than having the locus being at the top and the fulcrum being at the top and the center of all power being at the top. It's going to come down. It's kind of like a democratization process where the feminine energies, the maternal energies, will now come back into the fray, into the foray, and help balance things out.
Do you see that happen?
I do to a certain extent. I mean, there was a study last year that said 40% of American homes now have women as the main breadwinners. So that's a shift. It's not necessarily outside of the patriarchal paradigm, but it is still a shift within the patriarchal paradigm where women are, in a lot of ways, asserting themselves and claiming what is rightfully theirs, because patriarchal mindset isn't necessarily going to just bend over. So I do and I don't. It's not a uniform process at all.
Hi. So I feel like if I have a second, could use a refresher on how you see the myceliation being the front in this and how that pattern fits into the change that you're describing with
Okay.
the patriarchal model, because like I followed that in the beginning with the slide you have up now and those other ones, but then it seemed to not be as present.
Okay, so thanks for that. Right now, the power structure is hierarchical, top-down, right? And it's pretty rigid in that sense. Whether it's Christianity or any educational institution, it's usually the dean is a man, or the pope is a man, or the shaman is a man, and it's a top-down hierarchy, and that's the structure. It's kind of like the Christian cross, where the locus is at the top, and it holds up a man. What I think is going to happen is the locus, the focal point, the fulcrum is going to come down in this in this analogy, right? And things are going to be more interconnected and mycelial, and that type of awareness is going to start being how we see things and how we operate and how we behave and how we co-create new structures. So it'll be more relational and horizontal rather than just coming top down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so more like the way mushrooms grow.
Yeah, exactly.
Sprout and then do the thing. So you still have the masculine component, but it rises up versus comes down.
Right. So it's not a uniform, like, one-to-one thing, but yeah.
Maybe also as a decomposer too, huh?
Right.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Tez. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.